Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Could you speak a little bit more about point to avoid farmed finfish and shrimp?
Yeah, absolutely. Should I just go ahead and?
Sure.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, good question. So when it comes to farmed finfish in general, one of the largest farm productions is when it comes to salmon and farm salmon. And right now we just know way too much about salmon in terms of the environmental impact that it has and the health benefits that it has as well. One example when it comes to the environmental impact that salmon has in terms of farm salmon is the feed that goes into the farm aquaculture. It's shown right now that most of the feed is coming from the forage species that is wild caught, things like herring and alewives. It's ground down into fish meal, and that fish meal is what goes to feed the salmon. And so if you actually calculate the amount of protein removal from the ocean versus the amount of protein yield from raising the salmon, it's actually a net loss to the ocean. So we're removing more protein from the ocean to feed the growth of salmon. And we know in the long run it's just not sustainable for the ocean. And then when it comes to farmed shrimp, 99% of the shrimp that we consume here in the States is imported. The majority of the imports come from Indonesia, or the majority comes from Indonesia. And there was a New York Times expose on the shrimp fishery that came out last year, and it exposed how much labor exploitation is throughout the entire value chain of shrimp aquaculture. And not only that, but the impact that the shrimp aquaculture has to the surrounding marine ecosystem. What typically we see in Indonesia is that the companies who do the farm shrimp will set aside these entire mangrove areas, and the mangroves are really critical habitat for other marine species that live there. And so the shrimp aquaculture is completely decimated these mangrove areas, and then left the local people with no other, or a depleted ecosystem basically. And so, for those reasons, the environmental impact, the labor exploitation, we just know way too much about, what's going on to be able to, recommend it. So that's the reason why we have it on the avoid.
Avoid.
Yeah.
Can you address a little more about increasing industrialization of the fisheries? I thought we'd already done that.
Yeah. And Matt can speak to some of this as well. I mean, I think and I was learning quite a bit of the history behind the industrialization of our fisheries in New England in particular. But I think it's, to some extent, there's always been a level of industrialized fisheries here in New England. What we're seeing play out right now are policies that, really began in the early 90s. And the policy is called an individual transferable quota. The acronym is ITQ. And the first ITQ system that started in the States was in 1991, and that was with the surf clam ocean quahog fishery, which most folks, if you've ever had clam chowder or Campbell's clam chowder, that's the fishery where that's coming from. So in 1991, we start this ITQ system with the theory that if we cap the level of volume of seafood that we're going to remove, we're going to cap the level of surf clams that are removed from the ocean, and we're going to allocate that out to permit holders based on a history of their fishing in the past. So the quota gets doled out almost like private property would. So all of a sudden, the permit holders have a quota that they can buy and sell and trade, as if it was like on a stock market. I don't know if folks are familiar with carbon cap and trade. It's a similar theory to that. And so it was only a matter of about 10 years before that surf clam ocean quahog fishery was bought up by some of the wealthiest multinational corporations, including the Westminster Bank, which is a Holland-owned bank. And 80% of that quota was literally controlled by 4 companies that were telling the fishers exactly where to go, how to go, and that particular fishery was, transformed into a more industrial model, right? That was in 1991. Since then, we've changed the name. They don't call it an ITQ anymore. It's called catch share program. And so catch shares can take on different forms, but in general, it's the same concept. You cap the level of allowable catch, you dole it out to, as if it's quota that attaches to a permit, and then that quota can be traded among different fishing businesses, right? And so right now in New England, we just started our own catch share program in 2010. And very quickly, it's a combination of both the ability to trade the quota. It's also a combination of some of our stocks that are going lower in terms of the allowable catch. But we're seeing a really major, consolidation that's happening, and a funneling of access and quota go to the businesses that have the most money. And that's not unique. We have other catch share programs around the states. Some of these catch share programs have been thoughtful to put in, safeguards to protect independent businesses, to protect what we call fleet diversity. To allow for some of the small boats, the mid-sized boats, and the large-scale boats to exist. An example of a cap would be like a cap, or an example of a safeguard would be like a cap on quota, right? Just at the minimum, say, no company can control over X amount of the quota. And a lot of the other catch share programs, they've done that. They've said no one can own, over 1% of the halibut fishery, as an example, in Alaska, right? So they have a cap. In New England right now, we have no cap for our groundfish. So, and then the same for the surfline ocean quail. They didn't put a cap into their ITQ either. So, a lot of our policy work, working with allied council members that share a vision for a fleet, a more diverse fleet that includes different gear types and different fishing communities and different scales of the fishery. We feel it's necessary to get these safeguards in place before it's too late. And so we've been working with fishing families around New England to organize and develop, some alternatives to insert into our catch share program to really improve it, so that we don't wind up going the same direction as the surfline ocean quail fishery. And that's another, getting back to the who fishes matters. It does. It matters. I think the alternative argument for the folks that are pushing the catch share model is to say, hey, if we cap the number of fishes being removed, and the scientists are telling us that's a biologically acceptable level, then it doesn't matter if one boat catches it or if 10 boats catch it. It's sustainable, and therefore we're okay with it. We're going to promote this because it's going to be healthy for the fish stocks. And our argument is that, well, no, actually, in fact, who fishes and who catches the fish does matter. There is a difference between just having one boat catch all the fish versus 100 boats. There is a difference of having a diverse fleet that's geographically spread out, that represents different types of gear, and allows access for new entrants and young people to get into it. So that's a pretty long-winded answer. Hopefully that.
And what is the reaction from the fishermen? What is the most reaction then? Which way do most people lean? The local fishermen?
Yeah, well, I think the fishermen who have been, I hate to use the term winners and losers, but the truth is that a lot of these catch share programs, depending on how they allocate that quota, they create the winners and losers. You have folks that got the quota and then folks that didn't. And the reaction from the folks who didn't, I think, have been strong supporters of building in safeguards to create more fairness, to create a level playing field, and ultimately to create a more thriving ecosystem too, because there's an ecological component here. A lot of fishermen, particularly the inshore fishermen, who have depended on the health of these areas for years and years. When the catch share program started, saw some of the biggest boats that had never fished in these areas for the first time, because they were able to acquire some of this quota and do the trading, be able to concentrate an enormous amount of fishing effort in these inshore areas. The fishermen are saying, this area can't hold this type of pressure. This is not good for the fish, And if this continues, there's no way I'm going to have a future in this business, because I need this inshore area to be robust and be healthy, right? So the fishermen who are having that experience are the fishermen that we're trying to elevate and trying to connect and trying to put in front of our decision makers to tell a story about this is what the problem looks like and we need a solution. On the other end, we have some of the big winners in the industry who feel very threatened, by this concept of safeguards in a catch-share system. Just a couple months ago, about 6 months ago, one of the largest fleet owners out of New Bedford came out publicly calling the small boat fishermen maggots, who were screaming at the sidelines, and it was a horrible, public statement, obviously, but it got published in one of the fishers' newspapers, and that individual has been very direct that anything that threatens his business he's going to fight it. He committed to spend $10 million to fight any type of safeguards that are put in place. He said that publicly. So that's the type of reaction that we're getting. So we know that we have our work cut out for us.
We're probably worried about putting food on the table and it's all money driven, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Sure, go ahead.
Yes.
Well, there was a little squib in the paper yesterday about the factory fishing for Menhaden here in Rhode Island, and that the local fishermen had no objections about these big factory boats that go coming in to essentially all the bait fishing out.
Yeah.
So, why isn't more being done to control that kind of system?
Yeah, and maybe I don't know if Matt has any thoughts. I mean, well, one thing off the bat, what you think about it, is the Menhaden, that's an issue, and then for the herring, it's a very similar issue, right? Both are so critical to our ecosystem that if you remove the herring and you remove the Menhaden, it affects all of the fish, right? So it's so critical that we're paying attention to the health of those species in particular. And at least in George's Bank, in the area where my family gets fish, the herring trawlers have had major impacts there, right? And so, in my experience, I know that we've had 15 years of trying to work together, bring fishermen who are affected, by the herring fleet, to talk about, well, this is the problem, this is why it's important, we need accountability. And it's been, to be honest, it's been a really long battle, but there's absolutely, folks who are working on it. And in terms of the policy, maybe Matt, if you want to.
Sure. So both Menhaden and herring are both forage fish. And both Menhaden and herring are forage fish species, and they're critical. They're basically nature's cheeseburgers. Everything in the ocean eats them if it's bigger than them. And so where they're distributed and abundant tend to drive where stocks of larger fish, what we would call food fish, table fish, higher order predators go. Politically, while they both have a similar ecological function, politically they're managed by two different councils. The Menhaden industry is managed by the Mid-Atlantic Council because the majority of the Menhaden that are taken in the United States are taken off of places like Cape Hatteras, Straits of mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, off of Jersey. The largest operating processing plants are in the Virginia Capes areas, that sort of thing. Last year, a number of NGOs were able to force through a dramatic reduction in, I think they cut the Menhaden catch by, I want to say 25%. They wanted 45%. We got 25%. I'm going to say we because it's no secret on the council. I work with the marine community pretty hard, pretty effectively. Right now in these issues, they've got the best ideas to solve the problems, so I talk to them a lot. So they've reduced, in the Mid-Atlantic Council, they've reduced the allowed Menhaden fishery by a significant proportion. I want to say 25%. I'm not, it might be 20. Anyway, between 20 and 25%. So that's a huge reduction in the amount of Menhaden left in the water itself. Herring fishery is managed by New England. In New England, it's a very complicated fishery. The Menhaden, by the way, is rendered into things like omega-3 fatty acids, toothpaste, cat food, fish oil, that sort of thing. And please don't wait for me to stop talking to eat. Please eat your food before it gets cold. This is monkfish. This stuff, actually, monkfish is in okay shape for now, as far as we know. We don't know much about it. but it's tasty. Herring, the problem with herring is that there's a variety of different species that mix together offshore. River herring is comprised of two species of fish, blueback herring and alewives. They come inshore to spawn during the spring, and then they go back out to sea, and they mix with the sea herring. When you've got midwater trawlers coming in sucking up Atlantic herring, they're also taking the sea herring. And in the last 5 or 10 years, there's been a big push to try to reduce the amount of sea herring that is taken in this high-volume fishery. The way you do that is complicated. What you basically have to do is you have to have monitors on board the vessels who go through, and I mean, the amount of fish that are taken up in midwater trawl is so bad, they actually suck them out with vacuum cleaners. Large industrial pumps. They pump out the nets into the separator tank. The water spills off out of the tank, and then an observer comes on and samples a random selection to determine what level of catch, how much river herring is mixed in with the catch. Right now, there's no observers on the Atlantic herring fleet operating New England, and that's got to change. I worked hard to try to change that. And the industry itself has said, we want observers. And this is where it gets complicated. It's the National Marine Fisheries Service. And a deal was cut in June of 2012, where the industry would say, we will accept 100% observer coverage. We will pony up $350 a day to have them on board. The service said no, that we can't have that provision. And everybody this summer went absolutely out of their mind. Stark raving mad about that. Industry was livid. I was livid. I've got family in Naples, Maine, who are lobster fishermen. They're livid, and that's their source of faith.
Well, what's their motivation to say no?
That is the $64,000 question. I wish I knew. There is a legal precedent that they invoked, but my lawyerly friends say that it's a pretty obscure reference that basically is being invoked in a very obtuse way to allow them to say this. So I don't think this is driven by a legal concern. I think there's something else going on. I don't know. So the long and short of it, though, with the herring industry we got to be fair, the herring industry has said all the right things at the right time. We got to give them credit for that. However, they continue to fish, and they continue to fish hard. They are obeying the law. They have embraced a avoidance program so that when they find high numbers of river herring in their catches, and this is being administered through UMass Dartmouth, they radio in what they're finding so other people can avoid that area and shift operations to a different grid. Right now it's all voluntary. None of it has any force of regulatory power or pressure, and as Alexander Hamilton, if men are angels, there'd be no need, as Hamilton said, if men are angels, there'd be no need for government, and as a very battle-hardened mentor of mine said to me when I first got on the council, hope is not a firm management basis. So the herring issue is very complicated because you've got industry, you've got conservationists, and we usually see those two paired off. But you also have states, you also have the service, you also have local politics. The reality is that most of the herring consumed in New England is consumed as bait for the lobster community. So in that sense, we're inverting the trophic flow. We're taking a higher order animal and killing it and shoving it in lobster cans to lobster pots to feed a lower order animal. Menhaden's taken for bait as well. It's a very traditional bait fish. That's happening in a number of different fisheries. Brett mentioned the shrimp fishery. We were talking earlier about how a lot of menhaden and herring are being exported out to become fish meal for farmed fish plants. So again, we have this inversion of the ecosystem. That makes industrial sense, but it doesn't make ecological sense. And what we need to do is figure out a way where our economics, the economic sense lines up with our ecological sense. So it gets very complicated. I mean, the problem with fisheries management is that unlike privately owned resources, where the landowner has ultimate say and ultimate accountability for what goes on their land, on the fisheries, outside 3 nautical miles, everyone by law has a right to an opinion. And right now, the process by which these fisheries are managed, at least again in the New England context, which is the one I know, you have a lot of lobbyists on both sides, green and industry, there. They're lobbyists, they're trained lawyers, they know the law, they know the industry, they know this inside and out. When Brett's there, he advocates for his causes. There are people who I'm sure get paid a lot more than me to advocate for their causes. And ultimately, at the end of the day, it's a political process. The problem is that there are very few people in the process representing those who are not there in the process. Fish, small-scale fishing. The battle in the 1990s, the combination of fleet consolidation, collapsing stock sizes on Georgia's bank fisheries, took the heart out of a lot of the small-scale fishermen. It knocked the wind out of them, and it did knock them out of the industry entirely. We don't have council meetings, or we have more than 10 or 15 or 20 fishermen there telling us what's going on. We've got people who are trundled out by the lobbyists to tell us what they've been told. And again, no offense, but this is the tactic that's used on both sides of the aisle. And there are days when I embrace it, and there are days when I hate it. But the fact of the matter is, last week we had a council meeting down the street, and we had about 50 haddock fishermen arguing for effective herring management actions, and we had about 50 herring fishermen advocating for, well, actually the same thing, frankly, which is really kind of perverse. But I, as a counselor, that presence is important. I want to hear what fishermen are seeing from their own mouths. I don't want to have it pre-processed for me by a lobbyist or a lawyer or an activist, no offense. As smart, as intelligent, and as well-informed as these folks are. That element of public involvement has broken down in New England as stocks are broken down. The colleges have this concept known as a trophic cascade, where when there's a dramatic change in a trophic cascade, when you have a dramatic change in the abundance, either up or down, of a species at one layer in the trophic level, you see rippling effects 2 levels beyond it or more. And we usually use this when we're analyzing population explosions or population collapses. Is this affecting not only those species that are preying upon the fish that, say, is growing or contracting, but also fish that feed on those fish? We never think about carrying that metaphor into the human community. And yet that's exactly what we're facing here in New England, is that we have a trophic cascade. We have ground fish stocks that in some areas are really, really bad. And what's happening is as the health of those stocks collapse, the health of the fishing communities collapse. When the health of the fishing communities collapse, we get a problem. Because that's year-round jobs. That's people who put their kids into school. That's people who, out on the Outer Cape, where Brett's from, they had to shutter one of the high schools last year because there isn't enough year-round population to field a baseball team. So they consolidated these kids, and instead of being able to go 10 minutes to their high school, they have to get bused 25 to 30 to 45 minutes. Where is that? Provincetown. They had to close down Provincetown High School.
Chatham.
They closed down Chatham as well.
Harwich. So the kids in Provincetown go to a regional Monomoy, or not Monomoy. It's a school that's in New Orleans, Nauset. Nauset is the high school in New Orleans, so they go to Nauset. The Chatham High School is shut down, and so there's a combination of the Harwich and Chatham school they call Monomoy.
We are part of this trophic cascade. The small fishermen that are fighting hard to stay afloat are caught up in this trophic cascade. Our food choices are caught up in this trophic cascade. As consumers, though, we go to the fish market and we see fish on the shelves. There must not be a problem. But most of that fish is imported from outside New England. So again, what Sarah is doing through these dinners, through her outreach work, through her message and her mission, is challenging us to simply be more intelligent consumers about what we eat. And don't think as a consumer, but think as a top-level predator. Because that's what we are. And we have the ability to affect the way these trophic cascades ripple up and down. And what Brett's been talking about is merely a transformation of this transfer of energy within the food web into a transfer of economic power within the social web. And I'm doing my best to try to reconcile it. Sometimes I win, sometimes I lose. But you keep the fight up. And having fishermen in the room is essential. The work that Brett's doing is essential. What Sarah's doing.
Question. With the limits on fishing,
Yes.
tonnage and number of days at sea with these vessels, fishing vessels. What's the current situation with foreign vessels coming into our areas, such as the Grand Banks and otherwise?
Well, there are no foreign vessels allowed within 200 nautical miles of the United States coast.
So we know that doesn't happen.
That's gone. That ended with Magnuson in 1976. We excluded all, and as far as I know, there have been no permits issued to allow foreign vessels to fish in New England waters, period. Now, we do have access to the Grand Banks outside the Canadian 200-mile EEZ, and we do have fleets that operate out there, but these are large boats, distant water fleets. They're big. And not to minimize what Brett's been saying about using big boats inshore, where frankly I agree with him, they don't belong. Out there, you need a big boat to fish out there. It's a stable, safe platform that's going to come home, and it's going to bring back a catch, and people aren't going to die as likely. You send small boats to the northern edge of Georgia, they're not coming home. And what I worry about is someone feeling so pressed to the wall that they look at a weather forecast and they look at their engine and fuel capacity and say, yeah, I might be able to make it. I worry about that. Most fishermen, I think, are probably smart enough not to do that. But when people get desperate, they're desperate. So, back to your question. 200-mile, we established in 1976 a 200-mile exclusive economic zone that precluded all foreign fishing from our waters, with the exception there was a Hague Line negotiated in 1986 to separate the Gulf of Maine between Canada and the United States territories. But with that, there was the Magnuson Act established a permit process by which foreign vessels could gain admittance. But at that point, we have not, to my knowledge, we have not issued any permits to New England waters for foreign vessels to fish. I have to double check that, sir.
I'm not necessarily interested in the permits that have been given to foreign vessels. It's just plain old foreign vessels coming into the bay, the public name, but outside the bay, cargo.
Not allowed to happen anymore.
I know it's not allowed to happen. It hasn't happened.
I have not heard any incidents of foreign vessels operating in American waters.
We had a Russian vessel right out here off of
fishing.
It was permitted, no.
It wasn't permitted, but they had American vessels supplying.
Well, here's the interesting.
That's a little different story.
Yeah, they can buy. I think they can buy from American fishermen. I'm not sure. The other thing that has happened, however, is that the American fleet's gotten bigger in the last 4 years. You know, when Magnuson was passed in '76, this was the mom and pop, 60 to 70 footer versus the big 200 and 500 foot factory trawler put forward by, we blame the Soviets, the Japanese, but our Cold War allies, the West Germans, the Spanish, and the Portuguese, were doing their job too on New England. So we need to be fair about this. The State Department was auctioning off access to New England fisheries to beef up our position in Cold War Europe. So we blame the Soviets. They weren't the only ones doing it. We were giving away, the State Department was giving away access almost as much as the Soviets were taking it, and the Warsaw Bloc countries were taking it.
So basically you're saying we have no foreign invasion?
We have, as far as I know, there has not been any foreign vessels fishing
illegally.
Well, illegally, there has been no reports. In the year that I've been on the council, there has not been any reports given by the Coast Guard and the Enforcement Bureau that any foreign vessels have been caught doing that. Now, they patrol the Hague Line very aggressively, and most fishing vessels beyond, 150 meters? 50 meters? Vessels larger than 50 meters have to have an automatic identification system now, as of a few years ago. Now, so the AISs are also closely monitored as well. Now, do you have pirates in there? Possibly, but frankly, risking all that capital to catch a boatload of herring that's worth $50 a ton? Really? I mean, drug running is going to yield you a better return for your risk. And I think, the high stakes game it was in the 70s and the 60s and 70s, it isn't there anymore. Largely because, frankly, it's easier to fish more abundant stocks in areas that don't patrol the fisheries waters. and the illegal fishing that's going on outside the United States waters, but in place in the Central Pacific, off of African coastlines, off the Somali coastline, that's much worse than anything that we're dealing with here now, and probably anything we've ever dealt with before. I mean, you've got factory ships from all over the world going down to places off of Angola, for example. I have a colleague of mine at the University of Cape Town who's been looking into this, and they're just hoovering up anything. And the Angolan government is more than happy to take pay to look the other way, and that's completely unregulated. And I don't know. I know that it's a top priority for U.S. policy, but there's only so much we can do outside our waters. There's an international. Did that answer your question, sir? I don't know.
You did answer. I was just curious with the lack of number of vessels being on the water and the observation of foul play out there.
There has been, but we had a good report a couple months ago. The creativity which some folks have built in secret fish holds. There was one built into a groundfish guide right behind a wall with a big picture of the Virgin Mary on it. That was creative, panache. You got to give the guy style points for that one. He was caught along with two others. Unfortunately, so some statistics to be certain. The what's the rate the Coast Guard gives? They call it the compliance rate. Every fisheries council, they have a compliance rate report where they stop people and they give a percentage of people who are fully compliant. That has been in the mid 90% for as long as I've been on the council, and for a good time before that as well. 95% of the fishermen that they stop are fully compliant with everything that they're supposed to be compliant with. So we need to be certain that, I want to be clear that when I talk about the occasional creative pirate out there, this is not representative of the industry as a whole. It's not. And oftentimes those folks are shunned by the industry once word gets out that they've been doing this. Unfortunately, the number has gone from 98% down to 95% compliance. So folks are cutting corners as times get tough. Last year we cut quotas in some stocks by 70%. And that was a very difficult period of time. What's even harder is that this year, where the fishing year should be about 60 to 70% of your landings, not a single stock has been fished beyond 50% of the allowable cut quotas. This is a problem. This is a combination of, Sarah mentioned that this is a combination of global climate change, ocean acidification, changing patterns of primary productivity, the different phytoplankton that various animals eat. That's changing because of the changing ocean chemistry. But we're also got an ecosystem that has been ground hard for New England as a whole 400 years, Georges Bank for 150 years. We've been working on this resource very hard for a long time. That has something to do with it. 1986, I was a 16-year-old kid in Woods Hole, Massachusetts. People were talking about the collapse of the cod fishery. We went down to 50,000 metric tons of Georges Bank cod landed. Bounced back up, business went back to usual. Last year, we landed 5,000 metric tons of Georges Bank cod. We need to think the way that Sarah is asking us to think. We can't continue to buy cod. Back then, in '86, people were talking about the commercial extinction of cod for the first time ever. Now, people are just saying like, well, that's just what the ecosystem can produce. No, this is what we've engineered the ecosystem to produce. We need to take pressure off of those stocks to give them a chance to recover. That's both fishing pressure, but it's also through more effective habitat environmental measures. We need to leave more herring in the water, for example, to allow juvenile cod to grow to be mature cod. As long as if we're taking too much forage fish, whether it's squid or menhaden or herring, there's no forage base for those fish to stick around. They're going to where the forage is, and if that's in Canada, they'll go to Canada. There's no border patrol at the headquarters. Sir?
You mentioned the fact earlier on that there's other fish in the sea that no one really utilizes. Is there any way that you can see that you can promote these other types of fish? Because I'm sure a lot of these are caught just chucked back, probably dead or whatever. Is there any way they can promote these as being sustainable fishing, that's utilized rather than...
Right in front of you. Monk fishing.
I know.
Oh, yeah.
But I'm just saying, is there any way that you guys are knowledgeable on history and how information is disseminated? You mentioned the fact that quotas, these quotas are looked at on a more of a global basis or not a very regional basis.
Very
Is there any way that
national.
also identifying in certain regions that are key fish regions where those other kinds of fish are not utilized, they can be utilized rather than try and promote those within obviously the fish restaurants and supermarkets and hospitals that would help sustain and raise all these other types of fish that can be now eaten.
Absolutely. What's in front of you right now, monk fishery, didn't exist before the 1970s. And there's some dispute on this, but basically the scalpers claim they invented it, the groundfish guys claim they invented it, it kind of doesn't matter. But no one was eating monkfish. No one was eating halibut until the 1920s. No one was eating, I hope people started eating skate wings because I thought that was delicious. There's a lot. We tend to look at New England fishing, Brett and I were talking about this over dinner, we tend to look at New England fishing as something that's traditional and staid and unchanging and heritage and conservative. We need to think about New England fishing very differently, Mr. Walker. In order to survive, New England fishermen have had to have been innovative, adaptive, creative, responsive. I mentioned innovative before. Fishermen often will try to push hard for new species to be brought in. There's a number of test kitchens. Legal Seafoods has test kitchens, for example, in Boston. There's a fisheries organization. There's a number of fisheries organizations in New England whose members are fishermen, and they have kitchens and chefs who are willing to try something different. It's like, here's a bunch of this. What can you do with it? We're going to have to figure it out. The wonderful kitchen staff at Tallulah's tonight is working with stuff that most restaurants won't work with. But it's new, it's novel, and they believe in thinking differently. And so, I think we should also take, before the end of the night, thank them for their work tonight, of course. But it's, fishermen are pushing these things. There are government programs out there. Really, it's consumer demand. If there's no demand, small businessmen can't afford to burn gas catching fish that no one's going to buy. And so you got to remember, these are small guys, and they're offering on razor-thin margins. Yes, sir.
Board Secretary, I just build off of that a little bit with the hospital work. So from my family's experience, and the fishermen on Cape Cod who are really well known for the cod being the #1 landing, right? In the past 10 years, the #1 species landed in Cape Cod has been dogfish, right? I don't know if folks know dogfish is a very small shark, and in terms of the New England and Georges Bank ecosystem, it's really on the top of the predator chain, right? So it's a really healthy fish right now. It's delicious, I agree. And fishermen, like my dad, have been paid 12 cents a pound for them over the past 10 years. So it's a really low margin of profit. And what that does is force fishermen to catch in high volume, right? That's the only way that you can do it. And about 98% of all of our landed dogfish gets exported, right? So none of it stays locally.
Where does it go?
The main market, it's a good question. The honest truth is that there's little transparency about where it goes. If you ask most folks, they'll say that it goes to the UK. And is what is most known, or what's used mostly for the fish and chips that they call husks. So that's where I think a lot of the dogfish goes. But it's a really great example of this.
I just want to add to that before you move on to the next topic. I really wanted dogfish to be on the menu this evening, and I talked with Jake about it. Last year in November, we hosted a dinner here, and I tried dogfish for the very first time the way that Jake made it. He made it sous vide, which is when you put it in like a backpack pouch and cook it in a sort of middle temperature water bath, lukewarm, for an extended period of time. And it was amazing. I've been raving about it because dogfish, I hear these stories like what Brett is saying. It's incredibly abundant. Fishermen are getting paid next to nothing for it. And everybody I talk to has never tried it. So I've just been talking up that dish that Jake prepared all year long, and I really wanted her to make it again. But he couldn't get any. And this is the other missing piece of the puzzle. It is about consumer demand. It is about forward-thinking chefs. But there's another piece of the puzzle which is failing us at this moment, and that's the wholesalers. And they're not in the room, and I don't know how to reach them. And this is sort of the fatal flaw in the work that people like those of us here are doing. They're the people right at the middle of the they will know the cards when it comes to promoting species like dogfish. And I mean, one of the best things that we can do as consumers and as chefs is just I think maybe it's on the card that Brett handed out earlier. Just keep asking. If you go to a seafood counter and you don't see dogfish, even if you don't want dogfish, just ask for dogfish, because we need to get dogfish at every single seafood counter if we're going to sustain our fisheries in the Midwest.
Right. And yeah, for sure. So the hospital work that we've been doing is exactly what you were talking about. Let's introduce the hospitals to a new way of looking at their seafood, because the traditional way is they go for the same exact species. It's the farm shrimp, it's the farm salmon, it's the tuna fish, and the cod. They don't really steer away from that. And we know that if you have institutions like hospitals that are constantly demanding those species, it goes back to the wholesalers. That's all that they're really concerned about, and that's what they're going to pay the most for. And that gets passed on to the fishermen who are being told, these are the species that we care most about. If you land this, we're going to pay you more money. If you land the dogfish, we're not going to really pay you anything. So the institutional buyers like hospitals is really critical. And right now, the pilot program that we're working with the hospitals, we're working with dogfish. So for the first time, I talked with a chef over the summer at Boston Children's Hospital. They actually served dogfish to some of their patients. And it was really well received, and patients were really excited about the idea.
Maybe it's something called dogfish.
I know, we got you.
Yeah, name the dogfish.
It's a little marketing.
Yeah.
And change the name.
It's true, yeah. And just one last point about that too is that we also want to be careful that it's not just about promoting single species, right? Because we know that if we tell the hospitals or tell all of us here to eat dogfish, well, who knows what the ecosystem might do in 5 years or 10 years. Maybe that won't be what's being landed, and we don't want to wind up in the same position where we are now with cod, where everyone's demanding it. It's not abundant locally. The fishermen aren't really catching it, and so we're really substituting it with who knows what, right? We don't want to end up there with dogfish either. So the message is really about asking the questions about what is seasonal, what is local, what are the fishers in my community or my area pulling up in their nets.
One of the things you mentioned is that obviously application of certain species are improved whether it's worldwide or specific, that's how it's done. So obviously that information is disseminated marketing very well to people, because a lot of people understand what sustainability is. Right. They say, well, these people know what they're doing. They need now, because information gathering is so easy to disseminate. You need to localize that more, to say specifically, to get more details accurate. And they need to market this stuff that the accuracy of the information is different areas.
Yeah.
I need to understand that and get that information out to people.
Absolutely.
Because I think the youth of today, maybe not us, but our children are the ones that are listening to this information, right, aware of all the climate changes, aware of the seasons, of everything.
Right.
All is over the world, and they would want, really want to interested and want you to know more information. Right. They're the ones that share the information more than we do.
She contacts schools and go home assemblies.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to the level of transparency. And I speak with people who eat seafood all the time, and I hear the same thing. It's so hard for us to know where this came from, or who caught it. If we're on board in terms of the values, if we want to buy local and seasonal and ensure that there was fairness along the value chain, like, what are our options? And
like
so
socialism, I don't know, you better be careful.
or just that what I'm talking about is transparency, not to force it, but to at least allow the freedom of choice. You know, to say, well, I should at least get to know where this came from. You know, so I can choose if I want to put my values over here or my values over here. So it's a level of really freedom. It's not dictating. It's not like the list that we're talking about with good fish, bad fish. It's really transparent fish. So you can let people actually apply their own values, not tell them what to do. And so just to highlight one positive area right now in terms of transparency is the use of smartphones and QR codes. I don't know if folks are familiar with QR codes. It's like a barcode that you can scan into your phone and then up pops a web page. And right now there's wholesalers who are experimenting and piloting some QR codes that they get attached to the fish or the box or the package. And then it follows that fish along the whole way. So that if you choose to, if you're a restaurant or a retailer or even a consumer, you can scan it in and up pops the actual boat where it was landed, when it was landed, and how. So that's an exciting bright spot. You don't see it much right now, but it's starting to grow, and we're really trying to encourage more of that type of transparency.
Question.
I'm sorry, I know that there was one here first. No, did you still have the question? Oh, you're good. Oh, thank you.
The question is basically, what percentage of the U.S. catch goes to fertilizer?
That's a big question.
Fertilizing what?
Fertilizer. For crops.
Yeah, no, I know it's a lot of it. Do you have any idea?
It's not as much as it once was. Menhaden. So the menhaden industry was set up in the 1860s in this area. Well, when menhaden were abundant in this area. And they purse seined for it. They brought the fish back to a processing plant that basically boiled it and separated the oil from the solids. And the solids was called scraps mixed with various chemicals and packaged as fertilizer. We don't. The short answer, no, I don't know. It's not as much as it used to be for a number of reasons. It's a more expensive source of that organic compound, of those organic compounds. And I think there's an opportunity cost to sell them in a different form elsewhere, but I hope. I don't know, but I think it's that component. I think is not as much as it once was.
More fertilizer is actually petroleum based than organically based. So unless it's labeled as an organic fertilizer, chances are it's not fish meal. If it's just fertilizer, it's probably petroleum based fertilizer.
Petroleum or ammonia, right?
Yeah. Based petroleum derivatives.
Did anyone else have any more questions for Matt or Greg? Or for the chef in the kitchen?
Yeah, we need the chef.